On a warm Saturday afternoon in June 1960, four teenagers arrived at the shores of Lake Bodom. The water was still as a mirror, and the air carried the scent of pine and wild grass. They had two motorbikes and a single canvas tent they planned to share for the night. They were just looking for a bit of freedom away from their parents in the nearby city of Espoo. They set up camp on a small grassy peninsula that looked like the perfect place to watch the sun go down. Mela and Anja were only 15, while their boyfriends Seppo and Nils were 18. They spent the evening fishing and talking as the light faded over the trees. There was no one else around for miles, or so it seemed. They eventually crawled into their tent, which was a heavy canvas model popular at the time. It was a tight fit for 4 people, but they were young and didn't mind the squeeze. By midnight, the only sound was the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore. Tonight, I have 11 true stories for you. All of them involve a specific kind of danger, the kind that looks like a friend or a familiar face. It comes to you under the guise of safety or kindness, and the most terrifying part is that the person standing right next to you is usually the last one to realize what is happening. If you enjoy stories about the strange and the mysterious, told in a way that makes you want to double-check your locks, then you have come to the right place. The like button is still there, sitting quietly in the corner of your screen. It looks completely harmless, doesn't it? It is just waiting for you to notice it, patient and still. But maybe you should go ahead and press it now, before it decides to follow you home and start watching your house from the shadows. Just a quick tap to keep things friendly. After all, you never know what might happen if you let it sit there and grow resentful in the dark while you are busy listening to this story. I also want to know where you are listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. This video has been carefully put together with the sound of rain and white noise to help you settle in. Throughout the episode, you will hear a soft drizzle hitting the roof and a low, steady hum in the background. If it is already late and your room is quiet, you might find yourself drifting off before we reach the end. If that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing to the channel. The rain has started to fall now. At first, it is just a few stray drops, tapping against the window pane like a hand that is not quite sure if it wants to knock. Then the rhythm gets thicker and heavier as the clouds settle in for the night. It is a persistent sound, loud enough to drown out the noise of the street, but soft enough to let the rest of the world fade away. Take a deep breath and get comfortable. Let the shadows in the room grow longer as we slip into our first story. Back at Lake Bodom, the 4 teenagers were fast asleep by 3 in the morning. The air inside the tent was warm from their breathing, contrasting with the cool mist rising off the water outside. Nils was positioned near the edge of the tent, his head resting near the canvas wall. Everything felt perfectly normal until a slight shift in the environment occurred. A group of young boys fishing nearby later reported seeing the tent collapse at some point in the early morning hours, but they didn't think much of it. The boys assumed the teenagers were just messing around or that a pole had snapped in the wind. They saw a man walking away from the site toward the woods, but his face was obscured by the dim morning light. He didn't seem to be in a hurry. He just walked steadily until he disappeared into the thick line of trees. The fishermen continued their morning routine, leaving the collapsed tent behind them. It looked like nothing more than a heap of discarded fabric sitting on the grass in the gray light. Inside that heap of fabric, a nightmare was unfolding in total silence. There was no struggle that anyone outside could hear. There were no screams for help echoing across the water. There was only the sound of something sharp and heavy striking the canvas over and over again. The person outside wasn't trying to get in through the entrance. They were using the tent as a trap, keeping the victims pinned under the heavy material while they delivered blow after blow from the outside without ever showing their face. I should mention something about the equipment they were using back in 1960. These tents were made of thick, heavy canvas and were secured with multiple ropes tied to external stakes. Unlike modern tents, they did not have interior zippers that could be opened quickly in an emergency. To get out, you had to untie specific knots or crawl under the bottom edge. When the tent collapsed under the weight of the attack, it essentially became a heavy, suffocating bag that offered no way to see the attacker or escape. The fabric was pressed tight against their faces as the first blow landed. Imagine the smell of damp canvas, and the muffled sound of your own heartbeat as the world suddenly turns into a chaotic mess of shadows. You try to push up against the weight, but your hands only find more fabric. Every time you move, something hard strikes the material from the other side. You can't see the hand holding the weapon, only the indentation it makes as it sinks into the tent again and again until the movement stops. When a local man finally decided to check on the campsite later that morning, he found a scene that looked like it belonged in a war zone. The tent was shredded and soaked in dark red stains. Nils was lying on top of the collapsed material, his face a mask of blood and his jaw shattered. He was barely conscious, moaning in a way that didn't sound human. The other three teenagers were still underneath the canvas. They were not moving. The police were called immediately, but the damage was already done. Mila, Anja, and Seppo had all died from severe blunt force trauma to the head and multiple stab wounds. The attacker had been incredibly precise, hitting them through the tent in a way that suggested they knew exactly where each person was sleeping. Curiously, the killer hadn't taken anything of great value. The motorbikes were still there, and the wallets hadn't been emptied. The only things missing were the keys to the bikes and a pair of Nils's shoes, which were found hidden in the woods a short distance away. The investigation was massive, but it ran into walls almost immediately. The police didn't secure the scene properly, allowing curious onlookers to walk all over the area and destroy potential footprints. They interviewed hundreds of people, including a local kiosk owner named Carl Gillstrom. He was known to hate campers and had been seen throwing rocks at tents in the past. On his deathbed years later, he reportedly confessed to the murders, but his wife later claimed she had given him a false alibi out of fear. Another suspect was a man named Hans Assmann, who arrived at a nearby hospital the day after the murders with fingernails black with dirt and clothes covered in red stains. He acted extremely nervous and pretended to be unconscious when doctors tried to question him. Some people believed he was a foreign operative or a spy, which added a layer of political mystery to the case. However, the police never found enough hard evidence to link him or Gillstrom to the actual crime scene on the peninsula. For decades, the Lake Bodom murders remained the most famous unsolved mystery in all of Northern Europe. The peninsula became a place that people avoided after dark, and the story was told to every child in Finland as a warning. Nils Gustafsson eventually recovered from his physical injuries, though he claimed to have no memory of the attack itself. He got married, found a steady job, and lived a quiet life for over 40 years, far away from the headlines and the questions. Then, in 2004, the case took a turn that no one expected. Forensic technology had advanced to the point where blood spatter analysis could tell a story that the human eye had missed in 1960. Investigators re-examined the shoes that had been found in the woods and the stains on the tent. They discovered that the blood on the outside of Nils's shoes belonged to the other three victims, but there was no blood inside the shoes where his feet would have been. The prosecution argued that this meant Nils must have been wearing the shoes while he killed his friends, and then he hid them in the woods before returning to the tent to stage his own injuries. They claimed a fight had broken out over Mela, and Nils had snapped in a fit of jealousy. He was arrested and put on trial in a courtroom filled with media from around the world. The man who had been the lone survivor for 4 decades was now being called a cold-blooded killer. The trial lasted for weeks, as experts debated the physics of blood droplets and the severity of Nils's 1960 injuries. His defense team argued that it would have been physically impossible for a man with a broken jaw and a concussion to carry out such a brutal and coordinated attack on 3 people. They also pointed out that the original witness statements from the young fisherman mentioned a different man walking away from the scene, a man who did not look like Nils. In the end, the court decided that the new forensic evidence was not enough to overcome the lack of a weapon or a clear motive after so much time had passed. In 2005, Nils Gustafsson was found not guilty of all charges. He was awarded a large sum of money by the Finnish government for the mental suffering caused by the long detention. He walked out of the courtroom a free man, but the cloud of suspicion never fully disappeared from his name. Today, Nils is an old man living in retirement, and he remains the only person who was there that night who is still alive. The tent from Lake Bodom is kept in a police evidence locker, a silent witness to a crime that refuses to be solved. People still visit the peninsula, and some even try to camp in the same spot, but the atmosphere there is heavy. You can still see the trees that were standing back in 1960, watching over the grass where 4 lives were changed. The killer of Lake Bodom, if it wasn't Nils, would likely be long dead by now. They may have lived an entire life with the memory of that morning tucked away in the back of their mind. They may have sat at dinner tables and walked through grocery stores, looking just like anyone else, while the mystery they created continued to haunt an entire nation. The case is a reminder that the most peaceful places can hold the darkest secrets, and sometimes the truth stays buried forever. As the memory of that quiet lake in Finland starts to fade, the air around us seems to grow even colder. We are leaving the summer nights of Northern Europe behind and heading toward a place where the wind never stops blowing and the snow never melts. It is a place where a group of hikers thought they were safe in their own tent, only to find themselves running into the dark for a reason that still defies explanation 60 years later. February 1959. The Ural Mountains are a wall of stone and ice that separates Europe from Asia. In the heart of this wilderness lies a slope known to the local Mansi people as Kolat Sayakal, or Dead Mountain. It is not a place where people usually go to find peace. The wind there is constant, a low-frequency roar that never seems to let up, even when the sun is out. It is a landscape that demands total respect from anyone who dares to cross it. A group of 9 hikers, led by a 23-year-old student named Igor Dyatlov, arrived at the base of this mountain late in the winter. They were not amateurs. These were some of the most experienced climbers in the Soviet Union, all of them students or graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They carried heavy wooden skis, thick wool clothing, and a shared passion for the hardest routes they could find. They were looking for a challenge that would test their limits. They spent their nights in a large, handmade tent, huddling together for warmth while writing in their journals and taking photos of the frozen landscape. One member of the group, Yuri Yudin, had to turn back early due to a sudden bout of joint pain. He hugged his friends goodbye, not knowing it was the last time he would see them alive. The remaining 9 pushed forward into the high peaks, fueled by tea and grit, confident in their ability to navigate the terrain. By the 1st of February, the weather turned vicious. A blinding snowstorm moved in, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Instead of heading back down to the safety of the tree line, Igor decided to make camp right there on the exposed slope. He did not want to lose the altitude they had worked so hard to gain. They pitched their tent on the frozen ground and crawled inside, expecting to wait out the storm until morning. They had no reason to believe they were in danger. The tent was a long, narrow strip of canvas that offered the only protection against a wind that could freeze skin in seconds. Inside, they were likely eating a late meal and preparing for bed. We know this because of the items found later, a plate of sliced fat and some scattered pieces of bread. The atmosphere would have been loud with the snapping of the fabric as the gale outside hammered against the thin walls of their sanctuary. It was a cold, but familiar, routine. Back at the institute, families waited for a telegram that never came. When the search party finally reached the slope on February 26th, they found the tent standing in a state of eerie ruin. It was half buried in snow and appeared to be empty. As they got closer, they noticed something that made no sense. The tent had been slashed open with a knife, but the cuts were made from the inside, as if someone was desperate to get out as fast as possible. Most of their gear was still inside. Their heavy fur boots, their warm coats, and their survival tools were all neatly arranged or scattered on the floor. It was clear that whatever happened had occurred with such suddenness that they did not have time to put on their shoes. Outside, the searchers found a trail of footprints leading down the mountain toward the woods. Some footprints were made by bare feet, others by people wearing a single sock in 30-degree below zero weather. These 9 experts had walked nearly a mile through waist-deep snow in the middle of a Siberian night without any protection. In those conditions, a human being loses the ability to think clearly within minutes. Yet, they stayed together, moving in a straight line toward a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest. They were not running, they were walking with a grim, steady purpose. It was as if they were following a plan, even though that plan meant certain death. Underneath that cedar tree, the searchers found the remains of a small fire and the first 2 bodies. They were dressed only in their underwear. Their hands were covered in burns and skin was missing from their palms, suggesting they had tried to climb the tree so desperately that they tore their own flesh against the rough bark. They were looking for something back up the slope, or perhaps they were trying to stay away from something on the ground that was moving toward them. 3 more bodies were found between the tree and the tent, including Igor Dyatlov. They were spaced out as if they had been trying to crawl back to their supplies before the cold took them. They were face down in the snow, their fingers clawing at the frozen earth. At this point, the authorities assumed it was a simple, tragic case of hypothermia. The hikers had gotten scared by the storm, left the tent in a panic, and simply froze to death in the woods after losing their way. 2 months later, when the spring thaw began, the remaining 4 hikers were found at the bottom of a nearby ravine. They were buried under 4 meters of snow, and this is where the story turns into something truly haunting. These hikers were not just frozen, they had sustained injuries that seemed impossible in that environment. One man's skull was crushed. 2 others had their ribs fractured so severely that their chests had caved in, causing massive internal damage. I should explain a specific medical phenomenon called paradoxical undressing. When a person reaches the final stages of hypothermia, their brain malfunctions and they feel a sudden, intense heat. They begin to strip off their clothes, believing they are burning up, when in reality they are minutes away from freezing. This explains why some were in their underwear, but it does nothing to explain the massive internal trauma found on the 4 hikers discovered in the deep ravine. The doctors who performed the autopsies were baffled. The injuries were similar to the kind of damage you would see in a high-speed car accident. Yet, there were no bruises or cuts on the skin over the broken bones. It was as if their bodies had been squeezed by a massive, invisible hand that broke the bones without damaging the surface. And then there were the missing pieces. One woman was missing her tongue and her eyes. It was a scene of total, unexplained devastation. When the investigators tested the clothing of the victims, they found something that did not belong on a mountainside. Several garments were highly radioactive. The Soviet government, which was usually very thorough, suddenly went quiet. They abruptly closed the case and classified the files. The official verdict was that the hikers had died due to an unknown, compelling natural force. It was a phrase that explained absolutely nothing and only served to fuel decades of suspicion. Rumors began to swirl almost immediately. Some people pointed to the local Mansi tribe, suggesting the hikers had stumbled upon sacred ground. But the Mansi were peaceful, and there were no other footprints in the snow except for those of the hikers themselves. Others looked at the sky. Other groups of hikers in the area reported seeing strange orange orbs floating over the mountains that same night. They described them as silent, glowing spheres that moved with intent. Then there was the military theory. The area was not far from a secret testing range. Some believed a parachute mine or an experimental weapon had exploded above the tent, creating a shock wave that caused the internal injuries and released radioactive dust. This would explain why the hikers were so desperate to leave the tent, fearing the air inside had become poison, and why the government was so quick to hide the truth from the public and the families of the victims. For 60 years, the mystery of Dyatlov Pass was the ultimate cold case. But in recent years, a new theory has gained ground. It involves a very specific kind of weather event called a slab avalanche. This is not the massive wall of snow you see in movies. It is a solid block of ice and snow that slides just a few feet. If a slab had slid onto the tent while they were sleeping, it would have felt like the entire mountain was collapsing on top of their bodies in the dark. This would explain why they slashed the tent from the inside. They were being crushed and needed to breathe. The impact of the slab could have caused the broken ribs and crushed skulls. In their panic, fearing a second, larger avalanche was coming, they fled into the night. They did not stop to put on boots because they thought they only had seconds to live. They ran toward the woods because they believed the trees would offer protection from the sliding snow and wind. But the slab theory has holes. It does not explain the radiation found on the clothes. It does not explain why they stayed at the cedar tree for hours instead of going back once the initial event stopped. And it certainly does not explain the missing tongue. Some experts suggest that small scavengers like birds or foxes might have taken the soft tissue after death, but the hikers in the ravine were buried under thick ice where no animal could reach them for months. You are standing in the pitch black. The The wind is so loud you cannot hear the person standing 2 feet away. Every breath feels like swallowing broken glass. Your feet have lost all feeling, becoming heavy blocks of ice that you can no longer control. You look back toward the tent, but there is no light, no warmth, and no way to know if whatever drove you out is still waiting there in the swirling white. All you can do is keep moving until the cold finally takes you. In 2019, the Russian government reopened the investigation to put the rumors to rest. They spent months analyzing the slope and the weather patterns from 1959. Their final conclusion was that a combination of a slab avalanche and poor visibility led. However, for many of the families of the victims, this answer felt like a polite way to keep the real secrets buried from the world. The Russian authorities maintain that the mystery is settled, attributing the deaths to weather and a lack of experience in that specific terrain. But for those who have spent years studying the documents, the lack of external bruising on the shattered ribs remains a sticking point. The idea of a natural force being responsible is a tidy conclusion for a government, but it leaves the human element, the fear, the radioactive clothes, and the missing eyes completely unexplained. Today, Dyatlov Pass is a site of pilgrimage for those obsessed with the unexplained. The hikers' diaries are preserved, documenting their final days of laughter and camaraderie before the silence took over. The last entry in their collective journal was written with a touch of humor, mocking the difficulty of their journey. They had no idea that within hours, their names would be etched into a monument that stands as a testament to one of the greatest riddles of the century. Some of the rescuers who first saw the bodies noted that their skin had turned a deep, unnatural orange color. They also mentioned that the hair of the hikers had turned gray or white, even though they were all in their 20s. These details were often omitted from the formal reports, but they survived in the letters and personal accounts of the men who spent those cold weeks digging through the snow to bring their countrymen home for a proper burial in their hometown. Yuri Yudin, the man who turned back early, lived the rest of his life haunted by the fact that he was the only one who survived. He once said that if he had a chance to ask God one question, it would be, what really happened to my friends that night? He died in 2013 without ever getting an answer. His wish was to be buried in Yekaterinburg alongside his teammates, and today, they all rest together under a shared monument that lists each of their names. The dead mountain still stands, and the wind still roars across the slope where 9 lives came to a violent and confusing end. The snow has covered their tracks thousands of times over, but the story persists because it challenges our understanding of what is possible in the wild. It reminds us that even with all our training and technology, there are places on this earth where the rules of the civilized world simply do not apply, and the shadows have a weight of their own. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains a warning about the limits of human endurance and the unpredictability of the natural world. It is a story that refuses to die because it touches on our primal fear of being hunted by something we cannot see. Whether it was a block of ice, a secret weapon, or something even more exotic, the 9 hikers of the Ural Polytechnic Institute found themselves in a situation where their expertise meant nothing and the mountain took everything. As the Siberian wind dies down, we move from the frozen silence of the Ural Mountains to the humid, crowded streets of post-war Tokyo. We go from a mystery where the bodies were left in the open to a case where a man of immense power walked into a department store and simply vanished into thin air. It is a story about a different kind of compelling force, one made of politics, secrets, and a set of train tracks that were waiting for a position of importance to fall. The morning of July 5, 1949, started as a suffocating day in Tokyo. The city was still rebuilding after the war, and the humidity felt like a heavy, wet blanket draped over the crowded streets. Satonori Shimoyama sat in the back of his official car, staring out the window at the people rushing to work. He was the first president of the newly formed Japanese National Railways, a position that came with immense prestige but also a crushing amount of stress that few could truly understand. His driver, a man who had become accustomed to his boss's quiet moods, navigated the black sedan through the morning traffic. Shimoyama was dressed in a sharp gray suit, looking every bit the high-ranking official. However, his mind was elsewhere, likely fixed on the thousands of termination notices that had just been sent out. The orders had come from the American occupation forces, and Shimoyama was the one who had to carry them out, making him the most hated man in the country. As they neared the Nihonbashi district, Shimoyama leaned forward and asked his driver to stop in front of the Mitsukoshi department store. He told the man he had a few things to take care of inside, and that he wouldn't be long. The driver watched as the president stepped out of the car, straightened his tie, and disappeared through the large revolving doors of the store. It was 9:30 in the morning, and the store was just beginning to fill, with early shoppers looking for a respite from the heat. The driver parked the car and waited. 1 hour passed, then 2, and then the lunch hour came and went. He began to feel a knot of unease in his stomach as the afternoon sun beat down on the roof of the car. It was unlike Shimoyama to be late for his appointments, especially on a day when the railway unions were already on edge. By 5 o'clock that evening, the driver realized that his boss was not coming back out of the store. He contacted the railway headquarters, and the search officially began. Police and railway officials swarmed the department store, but it was as if Shimoyama had simply evaporated. No one recalled seeing a man of his description, and there was no trace of him in the restrooms or the staff areas. His family waited by the phone at home, hoping for a kidnapping call that never came. The city was on high alert, with rumors spreading that the president had been snatched by communist radicals, or perhaps had decided to go into hiding to escape the mounting public pressure. The answer came in the darkest hours of the following morning. A locomotive engineer operating a freight train on the Joban line noticed something unusual on the tracks near the Ayase station. He applied the emergency brakes, the heavy wheels screeching against the iron as the train slowed to a crawl. When the crew stepped down with their lanterns, they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A body had been scattered across the railway, fragmented by the passing of a previous train. The investigators arrived at the scene as the sun began to rise over the industrial outskirts of Tokyo. They found a single leather shoe, polished and expensive, sitting upright on the gravel several yards away from the impact site. Nearby lay a set of glasses with one lens cracked and a hat that matched the one Shimoyama had been wearing the day before. The identification was confirmed by the personal items found in the pockets of the tattered gray suit. The president of the National Railways had been killed by his own trains. A forensic debate immediately broke out that would divide the Japanese medical community for decades. The primary question was whether Shimoyama was alive or dead when the train struck him. This is an important distinction in forensic science, because a living body will produce significant bruising and internal bleeding at the site of a traumatic impact, whereas a body that is already dead will show very little reaction because the heart is no longer pumping blood to the damaged tissues. This reaction is known as a vital sign. One group of doctors from the University of Tokyo performed an autopsy and found almost no internal bleeding in the remains. They argued that Shimoyama had been murdered elsewhere, and his body was placed on the tracks afterward to make it look like a suicide. They pointed to strange oil stains on his clothing that didn't match the lubricants used on that specific stretch of track. It appeared as though he had been kept in a different location, possibly a garage or a factory, before being moved to the rail line. However, a second group of experts from a different university disagreed. They claimed that the lack of blood could be explained by the sheer force of the locomotive, which might have cauterized the vessels or caused a sudden shock that stopped the heart instantly. They believed that Shimoyama, broken by the weight of the layoffs and the threats against his life, had simply chosen a quiet spot on the Joban line to end his suffering. The police, under pressure to settle the matter quickly, leaned toward the suicide theory. The investigators began to retrace his final hours, looking for any sign of a struggle or a second party. They found a witness who claimed to have seen a man matching the president's description, walking along the tracks near the eventual crime site in the early evening. The man seemed dazed and was walking with his head down. But other witnesses at the Mitsukoshi store claimed they saw him being led toward a black car by two men in dark suits shortly after he entered the building. The stories did not line up. Then, a new piece of evidence surfaced in an abandoned building near the Ayase station. It was a small, dusty room that looked like it hadn't been used in years. On the floor, crime scene technicians found several Mernhat brown stains. When they tested them, they confirmed it was human blood of the same type as Shimoyama's. There were also scuff marks on the floor as if someone had been dragged. It started to look like the president had been held captive just a few hundred yards from where his body was found. The political climate of 1949 made a clear answer almost impossible to reach. Japan was under the control of the supreme commander for the Allied powers, and the Americans were terrified of a communist uprising. The railway layoffs were a key part of their plan to stabilize the economy, and any suggestion that the president had been murdered by political enemies would have sparked a massive revolt. Many people believed the investigation was being steered towards suicide to keep the peace. Shimoyama had spent his final days in a state of constant conflict. He had told his wife that he felt like he was being watched, and he had recently changed his daily routine. He was a man who valued order and precision, yet his final act, if it was indeed suicide, was messy and violent. It did not fit the character of the man who had spent his entire life building the railway system into a model of efficiency. The internal thought that he was the only one who could stop the chaos must have been heavy. You can feel the thick, humid air of the Tokyo night pressing against your skin as you stand near the tracks. The smell of creosote and old iron is heavy in the air, and the only sound is the rhythmic clicking of the rail joints as they cool in the dark. A distant light begins to flicker on the horizon, growing larger and brighter as the sound of the engine becomes a low roar that vibrates in your chest. The ground beneath your feet shakes, and for a moment, the world is nothing but noise and heat. Despite the discovery of the bloodstains in the nearby building, the official police report eventually concluded that Sadanori Shimoyama had committed suicide due to exhaustion and mental strain. They argued that he had walked into the department store, slipped out through a side exit, and spent the day wandering the city in a daze before finally ending his life. The case was formally closed, but the public remained deeply skeptical of the findings and the speed with which the matter was buried. The years passed, and the Shimoyama incident became one of the three great mysteries of the Japanese national railways. It sat alongside other strange derailments and disappearances that occurred during that same period. Many former investigators, after they retired, came forward and admitted that they were told to stop looking into certain leads. They spoke of mysterious black cars and men with foreign accents who seemed to be monitoring the case from the shadows, suggesting a level of involvement far beyond a simple suicide. When the statute of limitations on the case expired in 1964, any hope of a criminal prosecution disappeared forever. The files were moved to the archives, and the public's attention shifted to the new high-speed trains and the booming economy. But the Shimoyama family never stopped looking for answers. They hired private investigators and spoke to journalists, refusing to accept the idea that their father had simply given up. To them, the evidence of the oil stains and the blood in the building was undeniable. In the decades following his death, several whistleblowers from the era of the occupation suggested that Shimoyama was kidnapped by a special operations group. They claimed his death was meant to serve as a warning to both the labor unions and the railway management. If he had been allowed to resign, or if he had sided with the workers, the entire plan for the Japanese economy might have failed. In this version of the story, he was a casualty of the Cold War, a man caught in the gears of history. Today, there is a small memorial plaque near the site where his body was found. It is a quiet spot, often overlooked by the thousands of commuters who pass by every hour on their way to work. They are traveling on the very system that Shimoyama helped build, unaware of the man who died on these tracks under such mysterious circumstances. The leather shoe and the cracked glasses remain in a museum of railway history, silent artifacts from a day when a president walked into a store and never came out. The mystery of Sadanori Shimoyama is a reminder that the truth is often the first thing to be sacrificed in times of great political change. Whether he was a man who broke under pressure or a victim of a high-level conspiracy, his death remains a dark stain on the history of the Japanese railway. The tracks continue to run, the trains continue to arrive on time, but the shadow of that July morning still lingers over the line. The quiet in the archives is the only answer we are likely to ever get. As the sound of the Tokyo trains fades into the background, we move away from the industrial shadows of the city and toward the deep, ancient forests of Canada. We are leaving behind the world of high-stakes politics for a mystery that sat undisturbed beneath the trees for nearly 70 years. It is a story about two children who were found in a place where they should have been playing, covered by a coat that was meant to keep them warm, and a secret that stayed hidden until the very end. Stanley Park in Vancouver is a massive patch of green that sits right on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. It is over 1,000 acres of dense trees, winding trails, and rocky shorelines. For the people who live in the city, it is a place to escape the noise and the concrete. But in the late 1940s, parts of the park were so thick with brush that you could walk 20 feet off a trail and disappear completely from view. In January of 1953, a park ranger named Albert Tong was doing his usual rounds near a patch of woods called Beaver Lake. It was a cold, damp morning, the kind where the fog hangs low over the ferns and the ground feels soft under your boots. Albert was checking for fallen trees after a recent storm. He pushed through some heavy berry bushes, moving toward a massive, old-growth cedar tree that sat far back from the main path. As he reached the base of the tree, his foot caught on something hard and white poking out from under a pile of dead leaves. He reached down and brushed the forest floor away, revealing a small skull. Next to it was another one. They were positioned side by side, perfectly still in the gray light. They were not just skeletons sitting in the dirt. They were covered by a heavy, tattered wool coat that had been carefully draped over them like a blanket. Albert stepped back, his breath hitching in the cold air. He noticed a few more things scattered in the dirt. There was a pair of small leather shoes, much like the ones a child would wear to church. And sitting right between the two sets of remains was a small hatchet. It was the kind used for splitting kindling for a campfire. The metal was rusted orange, but it looked heavy and solid against the dark soil of the forest floor, marking a site of deep silence. The police arrived and began the task of processing the scene. They found that the children had been there for a long time, likely several years. The bones were small, suggesting they were quite young when they died. Based on the size of the skulls and the clothing found at the site, the medical examiner made an initial determination. He concluded that the victims were a boy and a girl, likely between the ages of 7 and 10, who had been left there together. I should explain a little bit about the geography of Stanley Park during this time. While it is a park, it is actually a temperate rainforest. The soil here is very acidic because of all the rotting cedar and fir needles. This acidity usually breaks down bone quite quickly, but these remains were partially protected by the thick wool of the coat. This allowed enough of the skeletal structure to survive for the police to see the clear, sharp marks left on the back of the skulls. The discovery sent a shock through Vancouver. No one could understand how two children could disappear and end up dead in the most popular park in the city without anyone noticing. The police checked every missing persons report from the last decade. They looked at orphanage records and school enrollments, but they found nothing. No one was looking for a boy and a girl of that age who had gone missing. They became known as the Babes in the Wood, a pair of nameless ghosts. For the next 7 decades, this case became a part of the city's identity. It was a mystery that every local knew. People would go to that specific tree near Beaver Lake and leave flowers or small wooden toys. They wanted to show these children that even if they were nameless, they were not forgotten. The police kept the little shoes and the rusted hatchet in an evidence locker, hoping that one day the technology would exist to give them back their true identities. The mystery remained untouched until the spring of 2022. A team of forensic investigators decided to use a process called genetic genealogy. They took a small sample of DNA from the remains and uploaded it to a public database. They were not looking for a direct match. Instead, they were looking for distant cousins or grandparents who had shared their genetic information online while researching their own family trees and ancestral histories. After months of digital detective work, the investigators found a cluster of people in British Columbia who were related to the children. They began making phone calls and digging through old family albums. They eventually reached out to a woman who remembered her grandmother talking about 2 little boys who had disappeared shortly after World War II. These boys were brothers, not a boy and a girl, as everyone in the city had believed for 70 years. Their names were Derek and David Dalton. Derek was 7 years old, and David was only 6. They were descendants of a well-known family in the area, but they had fallen through the cracks of history. Once the names were confirmed, the investigators were able to reconstruct their final months. They found that the boys lived in a small apartment with their mother, a woman named Diane, who was struggling to make ends meet in a very difficult and changing world. The atmosphere in Vancouver during the late 1940s was one of rapid growth and confusion. The war had ended, and people were moving in and out of the city constantly. Diane was a woman who had been through a lot of pain. She was raising the boys on her own, and at some point in 1947, life became too much for her to handle. Neighbors remembered seeing the boys playing in the hallways of their building, always together, always quiet. And then, one day, the boys were gone. When people asked Diane where they were, she would say they had gone to live with relatives in another province. No one questioned her. In the years following the war, families were moving all the time, searching for work or a fresh start. There was no social media or digital records to track where people went. If a mother said her children were with their aunt, you believed her. Diane continued to live her life in Vancouver. She never reported them missing. She never spoke of them again. She carried a secret that weighed more than the city itself. The investigators believe that on a gray afternoon in late 1947, Diane took her sons for a walk. They likely took the streetcar towards Stanley Park. It was a place the boys loved. They would have walked past the totem poles and the rose gardens, heading deep into the trees where the sound of the traffic and the city fades away. The boys were likely excited, thinking they were going on an adventure in the woods with their mother. They reached the massive cedar tree near Beaver Lake. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine and the sharp, cold salt from the nearby harbor. The only sound was the distant cry of a seagull and the wind moving through the high branches of the fir trees, making a noise like a long, slow breath. The ground was covered in a thick, spongy carpet of brown needles. It was a quiet, private place where the world felt miles away. Diane told them to lay down and rest, to close their eyes for a while. She used the heavy wool coat to cover them both, tucking the edges around their small shoulders to keep out the chill of the forest. She waited until their breathing became slow and steady. The woods were turning dark as the sun dipped below the horizon. The dampness of the forest floor began to seep into the wool, making it heavy. Everything felt still. There was no one around to hear the events that took place under the shadow of that ancient tree. She used the small hatchet she had brought with her. She did not use the sharp edge. She used the heavy, flat back of the tool, delivering single, powerful blows to the back of each boy's head while they were still tucked under the coat. It would have been over in an instant. They never woke up. They never felt the cold of the Vancouver winter. They remained exactly where they were, side by side, hidden under the fabric that was meant to keep them safe. Diane walked out of the woods alone. She left the hatchet there, right between her sons. She walked back to the streetcar and returned to her empty apartment. She lived for another 25 years, eventually passing away in 1975. She never confessed. She never showed any sign of the burden she was carrying to any of her friends or family. To everyone who knew her in her later years, she was just a quiet, elderly woman living a normal, unremarkable life. The reason the police could never find the boys was that they were looking for the wrong people. By assuming one of the children was a girl, they had excluded the Dalton brothers from their search for 7 decades. It was a simple mistake that kept the mystery alive for generations, while the coat stayed in place for 6 years before Albert Tong found it. The coat became a permanent part of the forest floor, slowly sinking into the needles and the dirt as the seasons changed. Today, the case of the Babes in the Wood is officially closed. Derek and David are no longer nameless ghosts. Their names have been added to the records of the city they grew up in. They have been given a proper burial, side by side, away from the shadows of the park. The massive cedar tree still stands near Beaver Lake, though it is a little larger. The brush around it is a little thicker than it was in 1947, but the spot is still recognizable. The story of the Dalton brothers is a reminder of how easily the most vulnerable can be forgotten by society. It shows that even in a crowded city, a person can be completely alone with a darkness that no one else sees. The coat and the hatchet are no longer in an evidence locker. They have served their purpose in telling a story that was hidden for so long. The park remains a place of beauty, but for some, it will always hold the memory of that wool blanket under the cedar tree. As the fog of the Vancouver forest clears, we leave the quiet of Stanley Park and head back across the ocean to the countryside of France. We are moving from a secret kept by a mother to a secret kept by an entire family of farmers. It is a story about a famous scientist who decided to spend a night under the stars, only to encounter a family. This family valued their own rules more than the lives of those passing through their land on a summer night. It is a case where the silence of the countryside was used to hide a crime that shocked the entire nation of France. The grass was tall, and the air was warm, but the hospitality of the farm was not what it seemed. We are traveling to the village of Lurs to look at the family that lived in the Grande Terre farmhouse and the secrets they kept behind their stone walls. The evening of August 4th, 1952, was exceptionally warm in the southern part of France. Along a quiet stretch of road near the village of Lurs, the air smelled of dry lavender and hot asphalt. A green Hillman car was cruising slowly, its engine a steady hum against the loud, rhythmic chirping of the cicadas. Inside were three people looking for a place to stop for the night and enjoy the countryside under the stars. Sir Jack Drummond was at the wheel. He was a 61-year-old scientist who had helped develop the food rationing system in Britain during the war. He was a man of logic and order, a person who appreciated the simple pleasures of a family road trip. Sitting next to him was his wife, Lady Anne, and in the back was their 10-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. They were on their way to a holiday in the Italian Alps and were in no hurry. The Drummonds decided to pull over on a flat grassy patch right next to the D96 road. It seemed like a perfect spot. Just a few hundred yards away sat a large stone farmhouse known as Grande Terre. The farm had been there for generations, overlooking the valley. Jack stepped out of the car, stretched his legs, and began setting up their camp for the night. They planned to sleep on cots beside the car, under the open sky of Provence. By 10 o'clock, the family was settled in. The only light came from the moon and the occasional flash of a car's headlights passing on the distant highway. It was the kind of peace that feels unbreakable. Jack and Anne were likely discussing the next leg of their journey, while Elizabeth drifted off to sleep. They had no reason to think that the elderly man watching them from the shadows of the farmhouse was anything other than a curious neighbor. The farmhouse was home to the Dominici family, a clan of tough farmers led by the 80-year-old patriarch, Gaston Dominici. Gaston was a man of the earth, hard and uncompromising, who had built a small empire on this rugged land. He lived there with several of his adult children and their families. To the local people, the Dominicis were a force to be reckoned with, a family that kept to themselves and followed their own set of rules. At dawn the next morning, a truck driver named Jean-Marie was making his way toward Lurs. As he rounded the bend near Grande Terre, he saw the green Hillman car still parked on the shoulder. Something looked wrong. The car's driver's side window was shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces that glittered on the asphalt. Jean-Marie slowed his truck and pulled over. He didn't hear any voices or any movement from the campsite as he approached. He found Sir Jack Drummond first. The scientist was lying on his back near the car, his clothes soaked in blood from multiple gunshot wounds. A few yards away, Lady Anne was found in a similar state. It was a brutal, sudden execution that left no room for survival. But as Jean-Marie looked around the site, he realized the 10-year-old girl was missing. He ran toward the farmhouse to get help, yelling for someone to call the local police. The police arrived and began a desperate search for Elizabeth. They followed a trail of flattened grass and small drops of blood that led away from the car and toward a shallow irrigation ditch. There, they found the little girl. She had not been shot. Instead, she had been chased down and struck over the head with the heavy wooden butt of a rifle. The force had been so great that the weapon had splintered, leaving pieces of wood in her hair. The discovery of the Drummond family murders sent a shockwave through France and the United Kingdom. It was seen as an attack on the very idea of safety and hospitality. The investigators immediately focused their attention on the inhabitants of the Grande Terre farmhouse. It was the only building for miles, and it was impossible for the family inside not to have heard the sounds of the struggle or the 3 distinct shots from a rifle. When the detectives first interviewed Gaston Dominici, he was calm and dismissive. He claimed he had been asleep all night and didn't hear a thing. The rest of the family members gave similar stories, their faces like stone as they answered questions. They were a united front. The police were convinced the family was hiding something, but without a weapon or a witness, they had no way to break the wall of silence that surrounded the farm. I should clarify something about the social structure of rural France in the early 1950s. In places like Provence, families often operated as independent clans where the word of the patriarch was absolute law. There was a deep-seated culture of silence, an unspoken agreement that family business stayed within the family walls. This meant that the truth was often guarded more fiercely than any piece of land or livestock, even in the face of a crime. For over a year, the investigation went nowhere. The Dominicus continued their work on the farm as if nothing had happened. However, the pressure from the police and the national media began to take a toll on the family's internal bonds. Rumors started to circulate that the brothers were fighting among themselves. The detectives sensed a crack in the armor and began bringing the sons in for intensive, one-on-one interrogations away from their father. In November of 1953, 15 months after the murders, two of Gaston's sons, Gustave and Clovis, finally broke. They told the police a story that changed everything. They claimed that their father had gone out that night with his old American carbine rifle to check on the campers. According to them, Gaston had gotten into a heated argument with Jack Drummond, which quickly spiraled into a violent and uncontrollable confrontation. The sons described hearing the shots and running out to find their father standing over the bodies. They claimed they had helped him hide the weapon and clean up the scene out of fear and loyalty. Based on this testimony, the police arrested the 80-year-old Gaston. He was taken to a jail in the city of Digne, where he initially confessed to the murders. He told the officers that it had all been a terrible, tragic misunderstanding. But as soon as he was put in front of a judge, Gaston retracted his statement. He claimed the police had pressured him into a false confession and that his own sons were lying to save themselves from being charged as accomplices. He accused Gustave and Clovis of being the real killers, turning the courtroom into a theater of family betrayal. The patriarch and his children began to tear each other apart in public, each side accusing the other. The night of the 4th was heavy and still. You can hear the dry grass crunching under heavy boots as someone moves through the dark toward the road. There is the metallic click of a rifle bolt being pulled back. The smell of gun oil mixes with the sweat of a man who has lived on this land for 80 years. A single shot rings out, followed by a scream that is quickly swallowed by the vast, empty space of the Provençal night. Despite the lack of physical evidence, the prosecution moved forward with the trial of Gaston Dominici in 1954. The case was built almost entirely on the testimonies of his sons and his own retracted confession. The public was divided. Many believed the old man was a monster, while others thought he was a victim of a family conspiracy. The trial was a spectacle of screaming matches and dramatic reveals that lasted for weeks. Gaston sat in the prisoner's box, looking every bit the weary farmer. He would often close his eyes or mutter to himself while his sons were on the stand. When it was his turn to speak, he maintained his innocence with a quiet, stubborn intensity. He argued that it made no sense for an 80-year-old man to chase a young girl down a ditch, but the jury was not convinced by his age or his protests. They saw a man who was used to getting his way. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning a verdict of guilty. Gaston Dominici was sentenced to death by guillotine. It was a sentence that felt like it belonged to a different century. However, the controversy only grew after the trial. Several investigators expressed doubts about whether Gaston had acted alone, or if he was even the one who pulled the trigger. They suspected the entire family had played a role in the violence. The death sentence was never carried out. President René Coty, sensing the growing unease among the public, commuted Gaston's sentence to life in prison. In 1960, after spending several years behind bars, Gaston was granted a pardon due to his failing health. He returned to the countryside, but not to Grande Terre. He lived in a small cottage until his death in 1960, still maintaining that he was an innocent man. The farmhouse at Grande Terre still stands today, overlooking the same stretch of road where the Drummonds once stopped to see the stars. The Dominici family eventually moved away, but the local legends about the night of August 4th continue to haunt the area. Some say the sons were the ones who did it, and the father took the fall to protect the family line, while others believe Gaston carried the secret of a much darker motive to his grave. The Drummond case remains one of the most famous and debated criminal files in French history. It is a story about the collision of two worlds, a modern scientific family from the city and an ancient, secretive clan from the soil. The truth of what happened in those few minutes under the moon is lost in the layers of family silence and legal maneuvering. The green Hillman car is gone, but the mystery of the 3 lives taken there remains. The silence of the French countryside is a specific kind of quiet, one that feels like it is hiding something just beneath the surface. It is a silence that can be found in many places if you look hard enough. As the echoes of the shots at Lurs fade away, we move from the stone walls of a French farm to the busy streets of Sydney, Australia. We are leaving the 1950s for a case that changed the way a whole nation looks at the idea of good luck. It is a story about a boy who disappeared on his way to school, just weeks after his parents had achieved the kind of wealth that most people only dream of. It is a case where the beauty of a garden and the dust of a construction site became the key to solving a crime that seemed impossible to crack. We are traveling back to 1960 to look at the kidnapping of Graham Thorne and the trail of evidence that led across the ocean. It was July 7th, 1960. Sydney, Australia was experiencing a cold, biting winter. The city was usually bright and loud, but in the suburbs of Bondi, the mornings were quiet and gray. People walked quickly with their heads down to avoid the wind coming off the ocean. On this specific Tuesday, the world felt like it was moving in slow motion under the heavy clouds. It was a normal day for everyone except for the family living at number 79 Edward Street. Basil and Hilda Thorne were still floating on a cloud of disbelief. Just 5 weeks earlier, they had won the state lottery. The prize was £100,000, which was an astronomical fortune in 1960. It was enough to change their lives 10 times over. They were ordinary people who had suddenly become the most famous faces in the country. Their names and their home address had been splashed across every newspaper from Perth to Brisbane. Their 8-year-old son, Graham, was a bright boy with a wide smile and a blue school uniform. He didn't really understand the money, but he knew his parents were happy. He spent his mornings getting ready for school, packing his leather bag and making sure his tie was straight. Graham was a creature of habit. Every morning at 8:30, he would leave the house and walk to a specific corner just a few blocks away to wait for a family friend to drive him to school. That corner at Wellington and O'Brien Street was his usual spot. He would stand there, swinging his bag, watching the cars go by until his ride arrived. It was a safe neighborhood where children walked alone all the time. On this morning, Graham kissed his mother goodbye and stepped out into the crisp air. He walked down the familiar sidewalk, his shoes clicking against the pavement. He reached the corner at 8:40, but he never made it into the car that morning. The first sign that something was wrong came when the family friend, Sergeant Larry Shea, arrived at the corner. He looked around, but the sidewalk was empty. He waited for a few minutes, thinking the boy might be running late, but Graham never appeared. Shea drove to the Thorne house to check on him. When Hilda opened the door and saw the sergeant standing there alone, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Her son had been gone for less than 20 minutes. A few hours later, a neighbor found Graham's school bag abandoned in a vacant lot several miles away. It was sitting in the dirt, still buckled shut, but the boy was nowhere to be seen. The police were called, and a massive search was launched. By the afternoon, the Thorne family's phone rang. A man with a heavy foreign accent spoke quickly. He told Basil that he had Graham and that he wanted £25,000 in cash by that night, or he would feed the boy to the sharks. This was the first time a kidnapping for ransom had ever happened in the history of Australia. The entire nation was paralyzed by the news. Thousands of volunteers joined the police to comb through the bushland and the suburbs. They looked in every park, every shed, and every basement. The kidnapper called 2 more times, but the directions for the money drop were confusing and the calls were too short to trace. After the 3rd call, the voice on the other end of the line went silent. I need to tell you about the way the lottery worked in 1960. Back then, there were no privacy laws for winners. When you won the grand prize, the government would announce your name, your photo, and your exact home address to the entire public. It was treated as a feel-good news story for everyone to celebrate. This meant that the Thorne family was essentially a target with a map drawn directly to their front door for any predator who was looking for a quick and violent payday. 5 weeks passed with no word and no sign of Graham. The hope that he would be found alive began to wither like the winter leaves. Then, on August 16th, a group of children playing in a vacant lot in Seaforth made a discovery. They saw a large, checkered rug bundle tucked under some low bushes. When they got closer, they saw a small shoe sticking out from the fabric. It was Graham. He was still in his blue school uniform, wrapped tightly in a heavy rug and bound with twine. The medical examiner determined that the boy had been killed within 24 hours of being taken. He had been struck on the head and then strangled. The lot where he was found was cold and damp, a lonely place for a child to be left behind. But the killer had made a series of small technical mistakes that they hadn't even noticed. When the police unrolled the checkered rug, they found it was covered in tiny, microscopic clues that would eventually lead them to a specific front door. Forensic science was still in its infancy in 1960, but the investigators in Sydney were determined. They took the rug to a laboratory and began vacuuming every inch of the fabric. They found 3 distinct things: tiny grains of pink mortar, splashes of light-colored paint, and thousands of microscopic grains of pollen. These were not just any pollen grains. They belonged to a very specific and rare tree known as the blue cypress, which was not common in the suburbs of Sydney. The police realized that if they could find a house that had pink mortar, light paint, and a blue cypress tree in the yard, they would find the killer. They began a door-to-door search that covered thousands of homes. They looked for construction sites and newly renovated houses. After weeks of searching, they found a house in the suburb of Clontarf that matched the profile perfectly. It had pink mortar between the bricks and a tall, healthy blue cypress tree growing right next to the driveway. The house had recently been occupied by a man named Stephen Bradley. He was a Hungarian migrant who had moved to Australia 10 years earlier. He was a man who always seemed to be chasing a new scheme to get rich, but he was currently buried in debt. His neighbors remembered seeing him standing in his yard, staring at the newspapers that featured the Thorne family win. They also remembered seeing a large, checkered rug hanging on his clothesline just days before the kidnapping. But when the police knocked on the door, the house was empty. Bradley had packed up his wife and children and left the country just one day before Graham's body was found. He had sold his car and booked passage on a massive ocean liner called the SS Arcadia, which was currently in the middle of the Indian Ocean heading toward Europe. He thought that once he was in international waters, he would be untouchable. He believed he had escaped the reach of the law. The Australian police didn't give up. They used the ship's radio to contact the captain of the Arcadia. They told him that a murderer was on board and that he needed to be detained. However, the ship was already nearing its next port of call in Colombo, Sri Lanka. A team of Sydney detectives boarded a plane and raced across the ocean, landing in Colombo just hours before the ship arrived. They were standing on the dock, waiting in the heat as the massive vessel pulled in. You are standing on the deck of a crowded ship, feeling the vibration of the engines under your feet. The air is thick with the smell of salt and diesel. You look back at the horizon, thinking about the quiet house with the pink mortar you left behind. You feel a sense of relief as the distance grows. But then the ship slows down, and you see the men in suits waiting at the pier. The sun is blindingly bright, and suddenly the space on the deck feels very small. Bradley was arrested the moment he stepped off the gangplank. He looked shocked, as if he couldn't believe they had followed him this far. He was extradited back to Australia, where he was met by a crowd of thousands of angry people at the airport. They had to use a decoy van to get him through the gates safely. During the interrogation, Bradley was cold and arrogant. He denied everything until the police showed him the microscopic evidence from the rug and the tree. The evidence was overwhelming. The pink mortar at his house was an exact chemical match to the grains found on Graham's uniform. The pollen from the blue cypress in his yard was identical to the thousands of grains found in the rug. Even the vacuum cleaner bags from his house contained the same hair and fiber samples found on the boy's clothing. Bradley eventually admitted to the kidnapping, but claimed that the death had been an accident, a story that the jury did not believe. The trial was one of the most publicized in Australian history. Bradley was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He was sent to the maximum security wing of Goulburn Jail, where he was kept away from the other inmates for his own safety. He died there of a heart attack in 1960 while playing a game of tennis in the prison yard. He never showed any remorse for what he had done to the Thorne family or the little boy in the blue uniform. The kidnapping of Graham Thorne changed Australia forever. The government immediately changed the laws surrounding lottery wins. From that day forward, winners were given the option to remain completely anonymous, and their home addresses were never published in the newspapers again. The sense of safety that people felt in their quiet suburbs was gone. Parents began walking their children all the way to the school gates, and the era of children roaming free in the mornings came to an end. Graham's parents, Basil and Hilda, never moved back into their Bondi home. The house that was supposed to be a symbol of their good fortune had become a place of unbearable memories. They spent the rest of their lives out of the public eye, refusing to give interviews or talk about the money they had won. For them, the lottery wasn't a prize, it was the thing that took their son away. The money sat in a bank account, mostly untouched, a cold reminder of what was lost. Today, there is no monument at the corner where Graham used to wait for his ride. The suburb has changed, the old cars are gone, and new families live in the houses along Edward Street. But the case remains a cornerstone of Australian forensic history. It was the first time that pollen and building materials were used to catch a killer who thought he had vanished into the ocean. The blue cypress tree in Clontarf is likely still growing, its roots deep in the pink mortar soil. The image of the checkered rug is still used in police training manuals to show how the smallest fibers can tell a story. It serves as a reminder that every action leaves a trace, even if it is invisible to the naked eye. The boy in the blue uniform has become a symbol of a lost age of innocence, a time when a lottery win was something to be celebrated rather than feared. The cold winter of 1960 left a shadow that still lingers over the city. As the memory of the Sydney winter fades, we leave the coast of Australia and head toward the humid, colorful streets of Rio de Janeiro. We are moving from a crime born of greed and lottery numbers to a tragedy that took place on the roof of a luxury building. It is a story about a girl who trusted the wrong people in a city that was obsessed with status and power. We are traveling to the year 1950 to look at the case of Ida Curie. July 14th, 1958. Rio de Janeiro was a city of samba and shimmering lights. Copacabana Beach was the heart of it all. The ocean breeze smelled like salt and expensive perfume. Young people crowded the sidewalks, dressed in their best clothes for a night out. It was a place where everyone wanted to be seen, a playground for the rich and the beautiful under the Brazilian moon. Ada Curie spent the early part of the evening at home with her family. They lived in a modest but comfortable apartment. Her mother remembered her being in a particularly good mood that day. She spent a long time choosing her outfit, finally settling on a dark skirt and a light-colored blouse. She looked at herself in the mirror, brushed her hair one last time, and told her parents she was going out for a walk. The walk from her home to the beachfront was a familiar one. She liked the way the city felt at night. The sidewalk along Copacabana was paved with the famous black and white wave pattern. She walked past the outdoor cafes where people were laughing and drinking. The sounds of bossa nova music drifted out from the open doors of the clubs. It was a night filled with the kind of energy that makes anything seem possible. She was 18 years old and had a reputation for being a good, studious girl. She had dark hair and a bright future ahead of her. She wasn't the type to get into trouble. That evening, she was just taking in the sights. She was dressed elegantly, looking like any other young woman enjoying a summer evening. She didn't have many close friends, but she was well liked by everyone in her quiet neighborhood. Near an upscale apartment building, she crossed paths with a group of young men. They were well-dressed and spoke with the confidence that only comes from immense family wealth. One of them was Ronaldo Castro. He was charming and persuasive. He struck up a conversation with Aida, and before long, he had convinced her to join them. He suggested they go up to the roof of a nearby building to see the best view of the ocean. The building they entered was called the Edificio Virginia. It was a luxury high-rise that stood tall over the surrounding streets. The lobby was filled with polished marble and the smell of expensive tobacco. The men knew the doorman, and they were ushered in without a second thought. They walked toward the bank of elevators in the back, their laughter echoing off the hard surfaces of the walls as they pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator ride was slow and steady. You could hear the hum of the electric motor and the faint clicking of the floor indicators as they rose higher into the sky. Ada likely felt a bit of excitement, thinking she was about to see a view that few people ever got to witness. The men continued to joke and talk, making her feel like part of their inner circle. They reached the top, and the heavy metal doors slid open. When they stepped out onto the roof, the heavy steel door clicked shut behind them. The space was wide and flat, surrounded by a low concrete wall. The noise of the street was suddenly distant, replaced by the whistling of the wind coming off the Atlantic. Ronaldo and his friend weren't looking at the ocean anymore. They were looking at Aida, and the friendly expressions on their faces had vanished entirely. I should tell you about the architecture of these luxury buildings in 1950s Brazil. These structures often had flat, open rooftops meant for communal gatherings or mechanical equipment. They were isolated from the main apartments by heavy steel doors that locked automatically. Once you were up there, you were essentially in a private world. Sound didn't travel down easily, making them perfect spots for things that needed to be kept out of sight. Neighbors in the building later reported hearing voices coming from above. There was the sound of a heated argument, followed by a series of sharp, muffled screams. But in a neighborhood like Copacabana, rooftop parties were a common occurrence. People often ignored the noise, assuming it was just the sounds of young people having too much fun on a Friday night. No one realized that on top of that building, a girl was fighting for her life. Ada was trapped in a space where there was nowhere to hide. She fought back with everything she had, but she was outnumbered and outmatched. During the struggle, she was choked until she lost consciousness. The men panicked as they looked at her limp body on the concrete. They believed she was dead and that they would go to prison. In their desperation to hide what they had done, they made a horrific decision to protect themselves. They picked up her body and carried her to the very edge of the roof. They looked down at the empty sidewalk 12 stories below. The city lights were glowing, but the street directly beneath them was quiet. They didn't think about the consequences or the life they were about to throw away. They just wanted the problem to disappear. They pushed her over the low wall and watched as she vanished into the darkness of the vertical drop. At approximately 8 o'clock, a loud, heavy thud was heard by a few people walking on the sidewalk. They found Aida lying on the pavement in front of the building. To a casual observer, it looked like a clear case of suicide. The police arrived within minutes and initially treated it as such. They cordoned off the area and began the process of identifying the young woman. She was still wearing her dark skirt and light-colored blouse. But when the officers went up to the roof to investigate, they found something that didn't fit the suicide narrative. Near the edge of the building, they found a single high-heeled shoe. It was sitting upright on the concrete, looking like it had been placed there with care. Suicide victims usually don't take off their shoes before they jump. It was a small detail, but it was enough to make the lead investigator stop and look closer at the scene. They also found a series of scuff marks on the roof that looked like someone had been dragged across the floor. There were small drops of blood near the door that led back into the building. The furniture on the roof had been moved recently, as if someone had been trying to cover up a struggle. It was clear that the roof had been the site of a violent encounter. The police realized they were looking at a murder scene, not a suicide. The medical examiner's report confirmed their worst fears. Ada had injuries on her neck and arms that had occurred before the fall. There were clear signs that she had been choked and physically assaulted. The cause of death was the impact from the fall, but she was already in a state of deep trauma before she hit the ground. This meant that she had been alive when she was thrown over the edge, a fact that horrified the entire city of Rio. The police began a door-to-door search of the building, questioning every resident and staff member. They soon learned about Ronaldo Castro and his friends. These were the sons of the elite, young men who believed that their family names were a shield against any consequence for their actions. Witnesses remembered seeing them enter the building with a young woman earlier that evening. They were arrested and taken into custody for questioning. During the interrogation, the men were arrogant and dismissive. They initially claimed they didn't know the girl and had never seen her before. But when presented with the witness statements and the evidence from the roof, their stories began to crumble. One of them finally admitted that they had been on the roof with her, but he claimed that she had jumped on her own after a brief argument. They were trying to stick to the suicide story. You are standing on the very edge of the concrete. The wind is pulling at your clothes, and the salt from the ocean is stinging your eyes. 12 stories down, the headlights of the cars look like tiny, slow-moving insects. You feel the rough, cold texture of the wall against your palms. The city is a million miles away, yet it is right there, glowing and indifferent. The only thing you can hear is the blood rushing in your ears and the cold air. The trial of Ronaldo Castro and his accomplices became a national sensation. It was one of the first times that the private lives of the wealthy were laid bare for everyone to see. The defense team was made up of the best lawyers in the country. They used every trick in the book to delay the proceedings and confuse the jury. They even tried to ruin Ida's reputation, suggesting that she was a troubled girl who had planned to end her life. The courtroom was packed every single day. People stood in the hallways and outside the building just to get a glimpse of the defendants. The media coverage was intense, with newspapers printing every detail of the testimony. The public was divided at first, but as the evidence came out, the tide of opinion turned against the men. They were seen as symbols of a corrupt upper class that felt it could do whatever it wanted without being punished. The most powerful moment of the trial came when the lead investigator held up the single shoe found on the roof. He told the jury that this was the shoe of a woman who fought for her dignity. He argued that it was physically impossible for someone to jump the way she did and leave a shoe in that specific position. The shoe became a silent witness for Ida, telling the story that she could no longer tell herself to the people in the room. One of the accomplices was a minor, and his lawyers fought hard to keep him from being tried as an adult. They argued that he had just been a follower and didn't have the intent to kill. This caused a massive debate about the juvenile justice system in Brazil. People were outraged that someone could be involved in such a brutal crime and face almost no prison time because of their age. It became a focal point for the entire legal battle. After years of legal maneuvering and appeals, the final verdict was finally reached. Ronaldo Castro was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. It was a landmark decision that sent a message to the rest of the country. Even the sons of the elite could be held accountable for their crimes. The public celebrated the decision, but for Ida's family, it was a hollow victory that could never bring back their daughter. The minor in the case received a much lighter sentence, serving only a few years in a youth detention center. He was eventually released and went on to live a private life, far away from the spotlight. This discrepancy in the sentences remained a source of bitterness for many people in Rio. They felt that true justice had only been partially served, and that the system still favored those who had the means to hire the most expensive legal teams. Ada Cury didn't just become a name in a police file, she became a martyr for a movement that demanded better protection for women in Brazil. Her death led to changes in how sexual assault cases were handled by the authorities. It started a conversation about violence against women that is still happening today. She became a symbol of resistance, a girl who wouldn't be silenced by the power of the men who tried to take her life on that roof. Today, the Edificio Virginia still stands in Copacabana. It looks like many of the other luxury apartments along the beach, with its balconies facing the ocean. But for those who know the history, it is a reminder of a night when a young woman's life was taken by those who thought they were above the law. The roof is no longer used for parties, and the doormen are much more careful about who they let into the building after the sun goes down. Ida's family spent the rest of their lives making sure she was never forgotten. They established a foundation in her name to help other victims of violence. They attended every anniversary of her death, placing flowers at the spot where she fell. Her brothers and sisters grew up in the shadow of the tragedy, but they used their pain to fight for a fairer society. They refused to let the narrative of the wealthy men be the final word on her life. The story of Ida Cury is a reminder that even in a city as beautiful as Rio de Janeiro, darkness can hide in the most unexpected places. It shows that the fight for justice is often a long and difficult one, especially when up against those with power. But it also shows that the truth has a way of coming out, sometimes through something as small as a single shoe left on a rooftop in the middle of a summer night under the Brazilian moon. The lights of Rio remain bright, but they can't hide the shadows that still linger on the terraces of the old buildings. As we leave the warm nights of Brazil behind, we move toward the industrial heart of West Germany. We are going from a crime of status on a rooftop to a murder involving a red Mercedes and a black notebook. It is a story about a woman who knew too many secrets and a government that wanted them to stay hidden in the dark. We are traveling to the year 1950 Bay to look at the life and the death of Rosemarie Nitrobit. She was a woman who navigated the highest circles of German society, only to find that the more you know, the more dangerous the world becomes. Her case would pull back the curtain on the corruption and greed that sat at the center of a nation's economic miracle, revealing a mystery that would remain unsolved for many decades to come. November 1st, 1957, was a cold and gray Friday in Frankfurt, West Germany. It was All Saints' Day, a time when most people were either at church or staying inside to avoid the biting wind. The streets were unusually quiet, filled with the kind of damp, heavy silence that follows a late autumn rain. In a modern apartment building at Stiftstrasse 36, the only sound was the muffled ticking of clocks and the distant hum of the city's rebuilding efforts. Rosemarie Nitrobit was not like the other residents of the building. While most people in Frankfurt were still struggling with the leftovers of the war, she was living a life of extreme luxury. She was 24 years old and had managed to climb from a childhood of poverty to the top of the social ladder. She was a woman who knew her value and had turned her beauty into a powerful tool for survival in a country that was obsessed with its own rapid economic recovery. Her apartment was filled with the latest furniture, silk curtains, and expensive perfumes that most German women could only dream of owning. But the most recognizable thing about her wasn't inside her home. It was parked right in front of the building. Rosemarie drove a bright red Mercedes-Benz 190 SL with a white leather interior. In a city that was still mostly painted in shades of gray and brown, that car was like a loud, defiant shout that everyone noticed. The car was her calling card. She would drive slowly through the high-end districts of Frankfurt, her white poodle, Mickey, sitting in the passenger seat beside her. She wasn't just driving, she was advertising. Rosemarie was a high-class call girl, but the term didn't quite capture her influence. Her clients were not ordinary men. They were the giants of the German steel industry, top-tier politicians, and the bankers who were funding the nation's massive new growth. I should explain the atmosphere of West Germany during this specific time. The country was in the middle of what people called the Wirtschaftswunder, or the economic miracle. After the total devastation of the war, wealth was returning at a dizzying speed. A new class of powerful men had emerged who felt completely untouchable. They had money, they had influence, and they had secrets that they were desperate to keep away from the public eye and their families. On that Friday morning, a neighbor noticed that Rosemarie's red Mercedes had been sitting in the same spot for several days. This was unusual, as she was a woman of constant motion. Even more concerning was the sound coming from her fourth-floor apartment. Mickey, the poodle, was barking incessantly, a sharp and panicked sound that could be heard through the heavy wooden door. There was no response when the neighbor knocked, only the sound of the dog scratching at the floor. The police were called to the scene around 4 p.m. When the officers arrived, they found the door was locked from the inside. They had to use a crowbar to force it open. As the door gave way, they were hit by a heavy, cloying scent. It was a mixture of expensive French perfume and the unmistakable sweet smell of something that had been dead for several days. The apartment was overheated, as the radiator had been left on its highest setting. Rosemarie was found lying on the floor in her living room, near a small table where a record player was still spinning, though no music was coming out. She was wearing a black dress, and her jewelry was untouched. There was a thin, dark mark around her neck, but there were no other signs of a struggle. The room was perfectly tidy, with every silk pillow in its place. To the first officers on the scene, it looked like someone had walked in, killed her, and then calmly left. The initial investigation was a mess of delays and missed opportunities. The police didn't secure the apartment correctly, allowing several people to walk through the crime scene before the forensic team could finish their work. They also struggled to determine the exact time of death because the radiator had been left on, which accelerated the decomposition process. However, the most important piece of evidence wasn't a fingerprint or a strand of hair, it was what was missing. Rosemarie was known to keep a small, black leather notebook. In this book, she wrote down the names, phone numbers, and specific preferences of every man she ever met. She also kept a record of the gifts they gave her and the conversations they had. She was a woman who understood that in her line of work, information was the most valuable currency. When the police searched the apartment, that black notebook was nowhere to be found. It had been taken. As the news of the murder hit the papers, a wave of panic swept through the highest levels of German society. Every man who had ever visited Stiftstrasse 36 was suddenly terrified that their name might appear in the police files. The media went into a frenzy, calling her the girl with the red Mercedes. The case became a symbol of the moral rot that many people believed was hidden beneath the shiny surface of the nation's new and sudden prosperity. The police eventually found a suspect named Heinz Pullman. He was a close friend of Rosemarie and a man who was constantly in financial trouble. Witnesses reported seeing him leaving the apartment building on the Tuesday evening before she was found. Just days after the murder, Pullman, who had been broke for months, suddenly paid off all his debts and bought a brand new car. It looked like a clear motive for a robbery, but there was one major problem. Pullman admitted he had visited her that Tuesday, but he claimed she was alive and well when he left. He said the money he used to pay his debts had been a loan from a business associate. The police found it difficult to prove otherwise because the time of death was still so uncertain. More importantly, Pullman didn't seem like a man who could have successfully hidden a notebook that contained the names of some of the most powerful people in the entire country. You are standing in the middle of a room where every object feels like it cost more than most people earn in a year. The air is thick and hot, making it hard to take a deep breath. You can hear the rhythmic clicking of the record player as the needle hits the end of the groove, over and over. The smell of jasmine perfume is so strong it makes your head swim. Everything is beautiful, everything is expensive, and everything is completely and utterly silent. The investigation began to feel like it was being slowed down from the outside. Every time the detectives tried to follow a lead that pointed toward a high-ranking official or an industrial tycoon, they were met with a wall of silence. The Black Notebook was rumored to contain secrets that could have collapsed the entire government. There were whispers that Rosemarie hadn't just been a call girl, but an amateur blackmailer who was recording her clients' conversations. This theory changed the nature of the crime. If she was recording men who held the keys to the country's future, she wasn't just a victim of a robbery. She was a threat to the state. The police found hidden microphones in her apartment, but the tapes were gone, just like the notebook. It became clear that whoever killed her knew exactly what they were looking for. They hadn't come for her jewelry. They had come to reclaim their own voices and their own reputations. The trial of Heinz Pullman in 1960 was a disaster for the prosecution. Without the notebook or any physical evidence linking him to the strangulation, the case fell apart. The defense argued that Rosemarie had dozens of visitors every week, many of whom were much more dangerous than a small-time debtor like Pullman. The jury agreed, and he was found not guilty. He walked out of the courtroom, and the case of Rosemarie Nitrobit officially went cold. Public outrage followed the verdict. People felt that the system had protected the powerful men at the expense of a young woman's life. The mystery of who took the notebook and who pulled the cord around her neck became a permanent part of German folklore. Books were written and movies were made, all suggesting that the killer was likely a professional who had been hired by a consortium of her wealthy clients to end the threat she posed to their clean images. Rosemarie's death marked the end of an era of blind optimism in West Germany. It forced the public to look at the dark side of the economic miracle. It showed that while the country was rebuilding its factories and its banks, it was also building a new kind of corruption that was just as dangerous as the war they had left behind. The girl with the red Mercedes became a ghost that haunted the conscience of a nation that was trying too hard to forget its past. The red Mercedes-Benz 190 SL was eventually sold and passed through several owners. Today, it sits in a museum, polished and gleaming under the lights. It looks exactly as it did in 1950 Bay, a beautiful machine that once carried a woman and her poodle through the streets of Frankfurt. But when you look at the white leather interior, it is impossible not to think about the secrets that were once shared inside that small enclosed space. Rosemarie's apartment building is still there, though the city around it has changed. The Stiftstrasse is no longer the center of the city's social life, and the fourth-floor apartment has been renovated many times over. New residents live there, unaware of the heat and the silence that once filled the rooms on that All Saints' Day. The barking of the dog and the spinning of the record player have long since faded into the noise of a modern and busy city. The Black Notebook has never surfaced. Most historians believe it was destroyed within hours of the murder, burned in a fireplace, or buried in a place where it will never be found. With it went the truth about the men who visited Rosemarie Nitrobit. They were allowed to keep their reputations, their families, and their power, while she became a cautionary tale about the high price of knowing too much in a world that values silence above all else. The mystery remains a reminder that the truth is often a luxury that only the powerful can afford to bury. Rosemary's life was a series of calculations, a climb from the bottom that ended in a room filled with expensive things that couldn't save her. She was a woman who thought she was playing a game with the men who ran the country, only to find out that the rules were written in a language she didn't fully understand until the very end. As the memory of the red Mercedes fades into the gray fog of the Frankfurt streets, we move away from the boardrooms of Germany and toward the muddy banks of a different river. We are leaving the 1950s for a case involving a woman whose life was taken by the man she should have been able to trust the most. It is a story about a doctor, a beautiful nurse, and a betrayal that was carried out under the shadow of a bridge in old Bangkok. It is a case that would capture the attention of an entire nation, showing that the most dangerous predators are often those who wear the mask of a healer. We are traveling to 1950 Chine to look at the murder of Nguyen Choy Petrung and the investigation that followed her body as it floated down the Chao Phraya River. It is a story of love, money, and a cold calculation that proves the heart can be just as dark as the deepest water. In the late 1950s, the city of Bangkok was a place of golden temples and winding canals that felt like the veins of the earth. The Chao Phraya River was the center of everything, a massive brown artery that carried boats, commerce, and the heavy silt of the tropical rains. Every morning, a thick mist would settle over the water, hiding the wooden shacks that lined the banks. The air was always heavy, with the smell of jasmine and old wood. Life in the city moved to the rhythm of the river. People bathed in it, washed their clothes in it, and relied on it for their survival. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. But on a humid morning in 1959, the mist was so thick that you could not see the other side of the bank. The water was unusually still, moving with a slow, dark intent that felt heavy and expectant under the gray light of the dawn. Nguyen Choy Petrung was a woman who seemed to have it all. She was a dedicated nurse with a reputation for being kind and incredibly efficient in the high-pressure environment of the city's hospitals. She had a soft face and a gentle way of speaking that made her patients feel safe. In the 1950s, being a nurse was a position of great respect, and Nguyen Choy carried herself with a quiet dignity that everyone in her neighborhood admired. Her life took a turn toward the cinematic when she met Dr. Athip Suralak. He was everything a woman of her status was supposed to want. He was handsome, highly educated, and came from a family with a long history of social influence. He was a rising star in the medical community, a man who seemed destined for greatness. When they started dating, people talked about them as if they were a fairy tale couple, the beautiful nurse and the brilliant doctor. They were married in a ceremony that was the talk of the town. They moved into a nice home and began building a life that looked perfect from the outside. Athip was always seen with Nguyen Choy on his arm at social events, smiling and looking like the picture of a devoted husband. They were the kind of couple that other people envied, a match made in heaven that seemed to promise a long and happy future, filled with success and high social standing. However, the reality behind the closed doors of their home was starting to show small, hairline cracks. Nguyen Choy was a woman of deep intuition, and she began to notice subtle changes in Athip's behavior. He was staying out later and later, claiming he had late shifts at the hospital. His once gentle tone became sharp and dismissive. He seemed more interested in the social circles of the very wealthy than in the quiet life they were building together. Despite these changes, Nguyen Choy tried to remain the supportive wife. She kept their home immaculate and continued her work at the hospital, hoping that this was just a phase brought on by the stress of Athip's career. She wanted to believe in the man she had married, the healer who had once looked at her with such adoration. She kept her worries to herself, not wanting to tarnish the image of the perfect marriage that they presented to the world. In the summer of 1959, the cracks became impossible to ignore. Nguyen Choy discovered that Athip had been spending a significant amount of time with a woman from a very wealthy and powerful family. This was not just a casual affair. Athip was looking for a way to climb even higher in society, and he saw Nguyen Choy as an obstacle to the future he wanted. He began to pressure her for a divorce, but Nguyen Choy, a woman of traditional values, refused. She believed that their marriage was sacred and that they could work through their problems. She did not realize that for a man like Athip, a refusal was not a reason to talk. It was a reason to find a more permanent solution. The atmosphere in their home turned from cold to terrifying. Nual Shawi began to fear for her safety, but she felt trapped by her love and the social expectations of the time. She started writing letters to her friends, documenting her fear. One morning in September, Nual Shawi did not show up for her shift at the hospital. This was completely out of character for her. Her colleagues called her home, but there was no answer. Athip claimed he had no idea where she was, saying she had left early for an errands run and never returned. He appeared to be a worried husband, calling the police and asking for help. But his eyes were cold, and he did not seem to be losing any sleep over her absence. A few days later, a fisherman working near the Nanthaburi bridge noticed something caught in the reeds near one of the concrete pillars. The bridge was a massive structure that spanned the Chao Phraya, a place where the current was particularly strong. The man paddled his small wooden boat closer, thinking it might be a piece of discarded clothing or a large animal. As he moved the reeds aside, he saw the face of a woman, pale and still in the brown water. It was Nual Shawi. She was still wearing her white nurse's uniform, though it was stained and torn. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and back. The brutality of the attack suggested a level of personal hatred that went beyond a simple robbery. The news of the discovery hit Bangkok like a tidal wave. The fairy tale was over, and in its place was a gruesome reality that the public found difficult to process. The perfect couple was a lie. Athip was called to the morgue to identify the body. He performed the role of the grieving widower perfectly. He wept openly and had to be supported by his friends as he left the building. He told the police that he was devastated and that he would do anything to find out who had done this to his beautiful wife. He suggested that she might have been the victim of a random attack by one of the many criminals who frequented the areas near the river. But the police were not entirely convinced by his performance. They noticed that while he was crying, he was also very careful about the details he gave them. He was a doctor, a man who understood how to manipulate facts. They began to look into his private life, and soon discovered the other woman and the mounting debts he had incurred while trying to live a lifestyle he could not afford. The image of the brilliant healer was starting to fall apart under the light. I should explain something about the Nanthaburi bridge. It was a common spot for people to throw things they wanted to disappear, because the water beneath it was deep and the current was fast enough to carry objects miles away in a matter of hours. However, the river has a way of returning what it takes. The way Nual Shawi's body had been caught in the reeds was almost like the river was refusing to let her story be buried in the silt of the Chao Phraya. The detectives began a secret surveillance of Athip's activities. They followed him as he met with a group of men who lived in a poor district of the city. These were not the kind of people a high-ranking doctor would normally associate with. One of the men was a known criminal with a history of violence. The police decided to take a gamble and arrested the group, bringing them in for questioning separately. They wanted to see who would be the first to break. Under the pressure of a long interrogation, one of the men confessed. He told the police that Athip had hired them to kidnap and kill his wife. He said the doctor had provided them with a knife and specific instructions on where to take her. They had intercepted Nual Shawi on her way to work, forced her into a car, and taken her to the bridge. According to the confession, they had stabbed her while she was still alive and then thrown her over the side. The most chilling part of the confession was that Athip had watched the entire thing from a distance. He wanted to make sure the job was done correctly before he went back to his life of luxury and social climbing. He had treated the murder of his wife with the same cold, clinical precision he used in the operating room. He was not just the man who ordered the hit. He was the architect of the entire tragedy, watching from the shadows as the life was taken. You are standing on the edge of the bridge in the middle of the night. The air is thick and smells like rain. Below you, the river is a vast, moving darkness that makes a low, rushing sound against the concrete. You can hear the sound of a car door closing in the distance. The only light comes from the moon reflecting off the water. Everything feels heavy and permanent, like the water is waiting for you to let go so it can take you away from the world. When the police confronted Athip with the confession of the hitman, he did not break. He stayed calm and denied everything, claiming the criminals were lying to save their own skins. He used his connections in the government and the medical community to try and shut down the investigation. For a while, it looked like he might actually get away with it. He was a man of power, and in 1959, power could buy a lot of silence in the city of Bangkok. But then, the police found the letters. Nual Chawi had hidden a small box of correspondence in the back of a closet at her workplace. In these letters, she described how Athap had threatened her and how he had told her that if she did not give him a divorce, he would make sure she never spoke again. She had documented the specific dates and times of his outbursts. These were not the words of a happy wife. They were the desperate records of a woman who knew she was dying. The letters were a breakthrough. They provided the motive and the evidence of premeditation that the prosecution needed. The trial was a media circus, with thousands of people gathered outside the courthouse every day. Nual Chawi had become a symbol of the exploited and the betrayed. The public was outraged that a doctor, a man whose entire life was dedicated to saving others, could be so cold and calculated in the destruction of his own wife for money. The hitmen testified against Athap, describing his coldness as they carried out the attack. They said he did not flinch or look away. He just stood there, checking his watch, as if he were waiting for a surgery to conclude. The jury was horrified by the details. Athap's defense team tried to argue that the letters were forged, but handwriting experts confirmed they were written by Nual Chawi. The wall of influence he had built around himself finally collapsed. Athap was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. The verdict was met with cheers from the crowd outside the court. However, due to his status and several appeals, his sentence was eventually commuted to life in prison. He spent the next several years behind bars, a disgraced man who had lost everything he had worked so hard to gain. He died in prison in the late 1980s, never having shown any remorse for the death of Nual Chawi Petrung. The case of Nual Chawi changed the way people in Thailand viewed the medical profession and the power of the elite. It showed that even a man of great learning and status could hide a monster beneath the surface. The story became a part of the local culture, with movies and plays produced to tell the tragic tale of the nurse and the doctor. It served as a reminder that the heart of a human being can be just as unpredictable as the currents of a great river. Today, the Nanthaburi Bridge is a busy thoroughfare, with thousands of cars crossing it every hour. Most people are focused on their commute and don't think about the woman who was thrown from the edge 60 years ago. But the locals still tell stories. They say that on particularly foggy nights, you can see a woman in a white uniform standing near the concrete pillars, looking out over the water. They call her the ghost of the bridge, a spirit that cannot find rest. The letters that Nual Chawi wrote are still preserved in a museum of criminal history. They serve as a powerful testament to her courage and her foresight. She knew she was in danger, and even though she could not save herself, she made sure that the man who took her life would never be able to hide from the truth. She left a trail of breadcrumbs in the form of ink and paper that led the police directly to the heart of the darkness that had consumed her home. As the sound of the Chao Phraya River fades into the distance, we leave the humid streets of Bangkok behind. We move away from the betrayal of a husband and toward a different kind of monster hidden in a residential street in London. We are leaving the 1950s for a case involving a man who appeared to be a harmless civil servant, only to reveal a graveyard hidden behind his kitchen walls. It is a story about the ultimate deception of a neighbor. We are traveling back to 1953 to look at the case of John Christie and the horrors of number 10 Rillington Place. It is a story about a man who used the trust of others to lure them into a trap from which there was no escape. His case would challenge the very foundations of the British justice system and lead to one of the most significant changes in law in the history of the country. It is a mystery that shows that the devil often wears a very boring mask. London, in March of 1953, was a place of shadows and soot. The city was still scarred from the war, and many of the houses in the Notting Hill area were falling apart. Rillington Place was a narrow, dead-end street that most people avoided. It felt cramped and heavy, with the smell of coal smoke and damp brick hanging in the air. At the very end of the street sat number 10, a house that looked like it was slowly sinking into the ground. The building was divided into several small, dark apartments that were rented out to people who didn't have many other options. The walls were thin, and the staircases creaked under the weight of the tenants. It was the kind of place where people kept their doors locked and their business to themselves. For years, the house had a reputation for being cold and uncomfortable, but no one suspected that the structure itself was holding on to a series of horrific secrets. A man named Beresford Brown had just moved into the ground floor flat. He was a quiet man who wanted to make his new home a bit more livable. The kitchen was a tiny, airless room with layers of old, peeling wallpaper that looked like they hadn't been touched since the 1930s. Brown decided that the first thing he would do was put up a set of wooden shelves so he could organize his cooking supplies and make the space feel less like a dark storage cupboard. The previous tenant of the flat was a man named John Christie. He was 64 years old and had lived in the house for over a decade. Christie was a former post office clerk and a special constable during the war. He was known as a polite, soft-spoken neighbor who was always willing to help out with a bit of advice or a medical tip. People in the street saw him as a harmless, boring man who kept his shoes polished and his garden neat despite the decay. Brown was standing in his kitchen with a hammer and a handful of nails. He chose a spot on the back wall near the stove and gave it a light tap with his hand. The wall didn't feel solid like brick. It sounded hollow and empty. He noticed that a specific section of the wallpaper seemed to be bulging outward, as if something were pushing against it from the other side. He took a small knife and started to peel back the edge of the paper to see what was behind it. The wallpaper was thick and damp, coming away from the wall in large, heavy strips. As he pulled, the smell of old glue and stagnant air filled the small kitchen. Behind the paper, he found a large wooden board that had been nailed shut across a deep alcove. It looked like an old pantry or a coal bin that someone had decided to cover up years ago. Brown used the claw of his hammer to pry the board away, expecting to find an empty space filled with dust. Instead, he saw a pale, thin hand. Then, as the board fell away completely, he saw a face. There were 3 women stacked inside the narrow alcove, one on top of the other, like discarded dolls. Their bodies had been wrapped in thin cloth and hidden behind the wallpaper and the wood. Brown dropped his hammer and backed out of the room, his heart racing against his ribs. He ran out of the house and found a policeman on the street, unable to explain what he had found. I should explain the way these post-war London houses were constructed. Many of them were cheap, multi-story rentals that had been divided into tiny, makeshift flats. To save money on repairs, landlords would often use thin wooden boards and layers of heavy wallpaper to cover up structural rot or unused spaces like coal bins. This created hundreds of small, airless cavities behind the walls that were never meant to be opened or seen by the people who were living there. The police arrived at number 10 Rillington Place and cordoned off the building. They realized immediately that they were looking at a mass murder site. John Christie was nowhere to be found, having moved out of the flat just weeks before Brown arrived. The detectives began a methodical search of every inch of the property. They moved from the kitchen to the small, muddy garden in the back, where the soil was soft and black under the cold London drizzle. In the garden, they made another discovery that made the veteran officers turn away. Buried just a few inches below the surface were the remains of 2 more women. One of the victims had been buried so long that a nearby fence post had been driven straight through her ribcage. The garden wasn't just a place for plants. It was a graveyard that Christie had been tending for years. He had sat in his chair and looked out at the grass, knowing exactly what was underneath. The police then went to the front room and started pulling up the floorboards. Beneath the wood, they found the body of Ethel Christie, John's wife. She had been tucked away in the crawl space, right under the spot where her husband used to sleep. The total count of victims eventually reached 8. Christie had been killing women for over 10 years, and he had done it all while living in a crowded house with neighbors just a few feet away through the thin walls. As the news of the discovery hit the papers, the people of London were gripped by a different kind of horror. They remembered a case from 3 years earlier, in 1950. At that time, a young man named Timothy Evans lived in the top floor flat of the same house. Evans was 25 years old, and he lived there with his wife Beryl and their baby daughter Geraldine. He was a single man who struggled with basic tasks and had a very low level of education. One day, Beryl and the baby disappeared. Timothy Evans went to the police and told them that his wife had died during a medical procedure gone wrong. He said that his neighbor, John Christie, had offered to help her and that something had happened. But when the police questioned Christie, he played the part of the respectable citizen perfectly. He told the officers that Evans was a violent man with a short temper who was trying to blame someone else for his own crimes. Christie was the main witness for the prosecution during the trial of Timothy Evans. He sat in the witness box looking calm and professional and told the jury that he had heard Evans arguing with his wife on the night she died. He said he had seen Evans carrying a heavy bundle out of the house. The jury believed the soft-spoken post office clerk over the confused and stuttering Evans. Timothy Evans was found guilty and was sent to the gallows in March 1950. Now, 3 years after Evans had been hanged, the truth was literally coming out of the walls. It became clear that Christie was a serial killer who had used Evans as a perfect scapegoat. He had manipulated the police and the jury, leading an innocent man to his death while he continued to live in the same house. The realization that the state had executed an innocent man because of Christie's lies sent a shockwave through the entire British justice system. The police launched a nationwide manhunt for the man they were now calling the Monster of Rillington Place. Photos of Christie's face, with his thin glasses and balding head, were posted in every train station and post office. He was a man who looked like a nobody, the kind of person you would pass on the street and forget 5 seconds later. This was exactly how he had survived for so long. He was a predator who hid in plain sight, blending into the gray background. You are standing in that narrow kitchen in the middle of the night. The only light comes from a single, dim bulb hanging by a wire. You can smell the sharp, chemical odor of the old paste and the heavy, damp scent of the plaster. You reach out and touch the edge of the paper. It feels cold and slightly soft under your fingertips. You pull back a layer, and the sound of the paper tearing is the only thing you hear in the total silence of the house. John Christie was found a few days later. He was walking along the banks of the River Thames, looking tired and disheveled. He didn't put up a fight when the officer approached him. He seemed almost relieved that it was over. During the interrogation, he began to talk. He described his methods with a chilling, clinical detachment. He told the detectives how he had invited women into his flat, offering them a special tea or a medical treatment to help with their ailments. He had rigged up a small tube to a gas tap in his kitchen. He would have the women sit in a chair and then secretly turn on the gas, making them sleepy and confused. Once they were incapacitated, he would strangle them with a piece of rope or a stocking. He spoke about his wife Ethel with no emotion, saying he killed her because she was starting to ask too many questions about the things she was hearing through the floorboards late at night. Most importantly, Christie admitted that he was the one who killed Beryl Evans and her baby daughter. He described how he had tricked Timothy into thinking he was helping them, and then murdered them both while the young father was at work. He had stood in court and watched Evans be sentenced to death, feeling no guilt at all. He had simply gone back to his flat at number 10 and continued with his life, confident that his mask of respectability would never slip. The trial of John Christie was brief. He tried to claim that he was insane, but the evidence of his careful planning and the way he hid the bodies suggested otherwise. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. On a July morning in 1953, Christie was taken to the same prison where Timothy Evans had been executed 3 years earlier. He went to the gallows in total silence, leaving behind a legacy of fear that would change the country forever. The case of Rillington Place became a central argument for the abolition of the death penalty in the United Kingdom. People could not move past the fact that Timothy Evans had been hanged for a crime he didn't commit. It took another 13 years of campaigning, but the law was finally changed in 1965. The tragedy of the Evans family and the victims of John Christie was the spark that led to the end of capital punishment in Britain. The house at number 10 Rillington Place was eventually torn down. The authorities realized that no one would ever want to live there again, and the building had become a destination for the morbidly curious. The entire street was eventually renamed, and the old structures were replaced with modern apartments. The city tried to erase the physical memory of what had happened, but the name John Christie remains a symbol of the ultimate betrayal of neighborly trust. Christie was a man who understood how to exploit the vulnerabilities of the poor and the desperate. He knew that in a city like London, a quiet man who kept to himself could do almost anything without being noticed. He used the structure of his own home to hide his crimes, turning a place of shelter into a house of death. He was a monster who didn't look like a monster, which is the most dangerous kind of predator there is. The leather shoes that Graham Thorne wore and the red Mercedes of Rosemary Nitribit are artifacts of their time, but the wallpaper of Rillington Place is a reminder of a different kind of horror. It shows us that evil can be papered over and hidden behind a polite smile and a quiet life. The walls of a house can hold secrets for decades, only revealing the truth when someone finally decides to look behind the surface and ask what is making the paper bulge. Today, the site of number 10 is a quiet residential area. People walk their dogs and children play on the sidewalks, unaware that they are standing on the ground where Christie once tended his garden. The soot of the 1950s has been washed away, but the story of the man who hid his victims behind the kitchen walls continues to haunt the history of the city. It serves as a reminder that the person living next door might not be who they seem. Timothy Evans was eventually granted a posthumous pardon in 1966. It was a formal admission by the state that they had made a terrible mistake. His remains were moved from the prison graveyard to a proper cemetery, where he could finally rest in peace alongside his wife and daughter. It was a small bit of justice that came much too late for a man who had been destroyed by the calculated lies of a serial killer in a gray suit. As the memory of the London fog begins to lift, we leave the narrow streets of Notting Hill and head toward the sun-drenched hills of rural Italy. We are moving from a house of hidden graves to a mystery involving a young woman on a Biblian and a scandal that would reach the highest levels of the Italian government. It is a story about a girl who went for a walk to clear her head and ended up at the center of a political storm that would last for years. We are traveling back to 1953 to look at the case of Wilma Montesi and the secrets of the Torre Annacca shore. It is a story about how a single death can pull back the curtain on the lives of the powerful and the corrupt, showing that the waves of the ocean can bring more than just sand to the shore. It is a mystery that shows that sometimes the most important part of a story is the piece that someone is trying to hide under the sand. It was a Thursday afternoon in April 1953 when Wilma Montesi stepped out of her family apartment in Rome. The air was cool and carried the scent of blooming jasmine from the balconies along the street. Wilma was 21 years old, a woman with dark hair and a face that people often stopped to look at. She was engaged to a local policeman and was busy making plans for a wedding that was only a few months away. Her life was predictable, safe, and filled with the small joys of a middle-class existence. She told her mother she was going for a walk to clear her head before dinner. Wilma suffered from a mild case of eczema on her ankles, and she had a habit of taking short trips to the coast to soak her feet in the salt water. She believed it was the only thing that really helped. She took her purse, put on her coat, and headed toward the train station. It was 5:30 in the evening, and the city was beginning to hum with the energy of people returning home for the day. The train ride from Rome to the coast usually took about 45 minutes. Wilma was seen by several witnesses on the platform, looking calm and perfectly normal. She was a woman who didn't like to attract too much attention, so she sat quietly by the window and watched the urban landscape turn into the flat, sandy plains that lead to the sea. She had done this trip many times before, and it was a routine that her family never questioned. She was a good girl who always came home on time. But when 8 o'clock passed and Wilma had not returned for dinner, her father began to worry. He walked to the local station, thinking she might have missed the last train or gotten delayed by a friend. By midnight, the worry had turned into a cold, hollow panic. The family spent the night calling hospitals and police stations, but no one had seen a woman matching Wilma's description. It was as if she had stepped off the train and walked directly into a void that the night had created. 2 days later, on the morning of April 11th, a laborer was walking along the beach at Torre Annacca, about 20 miles south of Rome. The sun was just starting to burn through the morning fog that sat over the Mediterranean. The man saw something dark lying on the wet sand near the water's edge. At first, he thought it was a piece of driftwood or a large bundle of seaweed brought in by the tide. But as he got closer, he saw the pale skin of a human arm. It was Wilma. She was lying face down in the sand, her body partially covered by the incoming waves. She was still wearing her blouse and her skirt, but her shoes and stockings were missing. Her skin was cold and had the waxy texture of someone who had been in the water for a long time. The laborer noticed something strange just a few feet away from the body. Her coat was folded into a neat, perfect square and placed on a dry patch of sand as if she had intended to come back for it. The local police arrived and conducted a very brief and disorganized investigation. They looked at the body, looked at the folded coat, and decided within hours that this was a tragic accident. They claimed that Wilma had walked down to the water to soak her feet, had been overcome by a sudden wave, and drowned. They ignored the fact that Torvayanica was miles away from where she usually went. They ignored the fact that one of her stockings and her garter belt were completely missing. I should mention something about the geography of the Italian coast in 1953. Torvayanica was not a popular public beach back then. It was a rugged, isolated stretch of sand that sat right next to a massive private estate called Capocata. This estate was owned by the Prince of Hesse and was a frequent gathering place for the highest levels of the Roman elite. It was a world of high walls, private guards, and secrets that the local police were not allowed to touch or even question. The official ruling of accidental drowning didn't sit well with the public or the press. A journalist named Silvano Muto published an article suggesting that Wilma hadn't drowned while soaking her feet. He claimed she had died during a drug-fueled party at the Capocata estate and that her body had been dumped on the beach to protect the people involved. The article caused a massive scandal, and Muto was actually sued for defamation by the government for daring to suggest such a thing. However, the trial of Silvano Muto became the catalyst for the truth to start leaking out. A woman named Anna Maria Caglio, who became known as the Black Swan, came forward with a terrifying story. She had been the mistress of a man named Ugo Montagna, who ran the parties at Capocata. She testified that on the night Wilma disappeared, she saw a young woman being carried out of the estate in a state of collapse. She named names that reached the very top of the government. One of the names she mentioned was Piero Piccioni. He was a well-known jazz musician, and more importantly, the son of Attilio Piccioni, who was the deputy prime minister of Italy at the time. Anna Maria claimed that Piero had been involved with Wilma, and that he was the one who had driven her body to the beach in the middle of the night. This wasn't just a murder mystery anymore. It was a political earthquake that threatened to pull down the entire leadership of the country. The pressure became so great that the government was forced to reopen the case and launch a formal inquiry. Attilio Piccioni was forced to resign from his position, and his son Piero was arrested and charged with manslaughter. The investigation revealed a world of corruption that the public had only guessed at. It showed that the police had been ordered to close the case quickly to protect the reputations of the men who spent their weekends at the Capocata estate behind those stone walls. During the trial, the defense team worked tirelessly to discredit Anna Maria Caglio. They portrayed her as a jealous, unstable woman who was looking for revenge against her former lover. They also brought in medical experts who argued that Wilma's body showed no signs of drug use or violence, despite the missing clothing. The logic of the case began to blur under the weight of expensive lawyers and political maneuvering that seemed to be happening in every corner of the courtroom. The witnesses who had initially supported Anna Maria's story began to change their testimony. Some claimed they had been mistaken about the dates, while others simply developed a sudden and convenient loss of memory. It became clear that the power of the families involved was reaching into the witness stand. The trial dragged on for years, moving from one court to another, until the initial shock of Wilma's death had been replaced by a general sense of fatigue and confusion. In 1957, the final verdict was delivered. Piero Piccioni and all of the other defendants were found not guilty due to a lack of direct evidence. The court ruled that there was no proof that a party had even taken place at Capocata on that night. The case was officially closed, and the death of Wilma Montesi was once again listed as an accidental drowning. The elite had won, and the girl who went for a walk to soak her feet was left without a voice. You are standing on the edge of the sand in the middle of a moonless night. The air is cold and smells like salt and rotting wood. You can hear the rhythmic, heavy thud of the waves hitting the shore, a sound that drowns out everything else. Your feet sink into the damp, freezing sand as you walk toward the dark line of the water. You feel a hand on your shoulder, but when you turn around, there is only the vast, empty space of the beach and the wind. The Wilma Montesi case remains the greatest unsolved mystery in the history of modern Italy. It revealed a divide between the common people and the ruling class that has never truly been healed. Wilma became a symbol of a lost innocence, a girl whose life was treated as a disposable object by those with the power to rewrite the truth. Her neatly folded coat on the sand stays in the mind as a sacrilege of a life that was interrupted by a darkness it didn't understand. Today, Torvajanica is a busy resort town with rows of colorful umbrellas and noisy cafes. The Capocata estate is still there, but much of the land has been turned into a nature reserve. People swim in the same water where Wilma was found, unaware of the scandal that once gripped the nation. The jazz music of Piero Piccioni is still played on the radio sometimes, a smooth and elegant sound that hides the shadow of a night on a beach 70 years ago. The white leather of the red Mercedes, the checkered rug in Sydney, and the wallpaper at Rillington Place all tell a similar story. They are the physical remains of lives that were taken by people who thought they could hide behind their status or their masks of respectability. Wilma Montesi was just a girl who wanted a bit of peace by the sea, and in the end, the sea was the only thing that didn't lie to her about what happened in the dark. We have spent the last few hours traveling through the shadows of the 20th century. We have looked at the frozen slopes of Russia, the dense woods of Canada, and the crowded streets of Bangkok. We have seen that the most dangerous places are often the ones that look the most familiar. Each of these 11 stories is a reminder that the world is a much smaller and more connected place than we like to admit, especially when it comes to the darkness. The mysteries we have explored tonight all have one thing in common. They show that every action, no matter how carefully hidden, leaves a mark on the world. Whether it is a grain of pollen, a drop of blood, or a letter hidden in a closet, the truth has a way of pushing through the surface eventually. It might take days, or it might take 70 years, but the silence of a crime is never as permanent as the people who commit them hope. As you sit there in the quiet of your room, listen to the rain hitting the roof. Think about the people in these stories who thought they were safe in their homes or on their walks. The world is full of beauty, but it is also full of variables that we can't always control. Take a moment to appreciate the safety of your own space and the people you trust. Double-check your locks one last time, turn off the light, and let the night settle in. These 11 stories are more than just accounts of crime and tragedy. They are a map of the human condition, showing both the best and the worst of what we are capable of. From the courage of the investigators who refuse to give up, to the resilience of the families who keep the memories alive, there is a thread of hope that runs through even the darkest files. The light of the truth is always there, waiting for someone to find it. I want to thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I hope these stories have given you something to think about and perhaps a reason to appreciate the quiet moments of your own life a little more. Remember to be careful out there, because the world is a vast place, and not every mystery has an ending that makes sense. Sleep well, and I will see you next time when the sun goes down and the shadows start to grow long again. The stories we have walked through tonight leave a specific kind of weight on the heart. It is not just the weight of the tragedy itself, but the heavy realization of how easily a human life can be erased by the choices of another. We often like to think of evil as something far away, something that looks like a monster in a movie or a headline from a distant country. But as we have seen, the most profound darkness often wears a very mundane and familiar mask. It is the neighbor with the neat garden, the doctor with the gentle hands, or the son of a powerful man who believes the world belongs to him. There is a terrifying banality in the way these crimes were carried out. John Christie didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man who would help you with your mail. Gaston Dominici didn't look like a murderer. He was just an old farmer tending to his land. This is the core of the fear that stays with us long after the audio ends. It is the realization that we are surrounded by people we think we know, yet we are only ever seeing the version of them that they choose to show us. The true nature of a person is often a secret kept behind a wall of politeness and social expectation. In many of these cases, the failure of justice is almost as painful as the crime itself. When we look at the Shimoyama incident or the death of Rosemary Nitrobit, we see the machinery of power working to protect itself. We see how the truth can be treated as a threat to the state or a nuisance to be buried under a pile of classified folders. It reminds us that justice is not a natural force. It is something that must be fought for, often against people who have every reason to keep the light from reaching the dark corners of their own lives. The loss of innocence is another thread that ties these 11 accounts together. Whether it is the children in Stanley Park or Graham Thorne in Sydney, there is a deep sense of a world being broken. These were children who were simply existing in their own small, hopeful lives before they were caught in the gears of someone else's desperation or greed. Their deaths changed the way whole cities looked at their parks and their streets. It reminds us that the safety we feel is often a fragile thing, built on a collective agreement that can be shattered by a single person. But there is also something to be said about the persistence of the truth. The fact that we are talking about Derek and David Dalton 70 years later is a testament to the fact that a name cannot be truly erased. The fact that a grain of pollen could catch a killer on the other side of the ocean shows that the universe itself seems to keep a record of what we do. Even in the cases that remain unsolved, like Lake Bodom or the Dyatlov Pass, the mystery itself is a form of memory. It keeps the victims alive in our minds, ensuring that they are not just numbers in a file. We live in a world that is obsessed with answers. We want every mystery to have a neat conclusion and every killer to have a face. But sometimes, the most honest thing we can do is acknowledge the silence. Sometimes the only answer we get is the folded coat on the sand or the rash tent on the mountain. These things tell a story of their own, one that speaks to the mystery of our own existence and the unpredictable nature of the paths we choose to walk. We are all just travelers moving through the dark, hoping to find a bit of warmth before the wind picks up. The geography of these crimes is also significant. The river in Bangkok, the hills of Provence, and the beach in Italy all became characters in their own right. They were the silent witnesses that held on to the evidence when no one else was looking. They remind us that the earth beneath our feet has seen everything. Every street we walk and every forest we enter has a history that is mostly hidden from us. We are walking over the layers of the past, and sometimes those layers are thinner than we would like to believe. It pays to be mindful of the ground you are standing on. As we conclude this journey, I want to leave you with the idea that the most important part of these stories is the human element. Behind every forensic report and every legal battle was a person who was loved and who had a life they were trying to live. The nurse, the scientist, the hikers, and the young women on the beaches were not just victims. They were individuals with dreams and fears just like our own. By remembering their stories, we give them a small bit of the life that was taken from them. We refuse to let the darkness be the only thing that remains of their time on this earth. The night is deep now, and the world outside is still. The rain has turned into a soft mist that hangs over the trees and the houses. Take a deep breath and feel the air in your lungs. You are here, you are safe, and you are part of a world that is still full of light and possibility, despite the shadows we have explored. Let the weight of these stories settle into a sense of gratitude for the people who look out for you and the order that keeps the chaos at bay. The sun will come up in a few hours, and the world will start again, new and filled with a different kind of energy. I hope you found something in these 11 tales that stays with you, not as a source of fear, but as a reason to be more observant and more compassionate. The mysteries of the past are a gift to the present, a set of lessons about the importance of the truth and the value of every single life. Thank you for listening, for your time, and for your curiosity. Stay safe, look after one another, and never forget to check behind the wallpaper. Good night, and sleep well in the quiet of the night that surrounds us all.